We thank you for this day and this chance to gather and think with Dr. Neal about our world. Let's see, how's that? Yeah. So it's good to see all of you. Thanks so much for being here. And I'm just delighted that we have Dr. Deonna Neal back with us. Deonna is an Episcopal priest. We were classmates at General Seminary in New York City, the Episcopal Church's oldest seminary. I graduated in 2001. Deonna graduated in 2002. And she went on to do a PhD in moral theology, the Catholic at Notre Dame. The Catholics call it moral theology. Protestants tend to call it ethics. It's basically the same thing. She did her dissertation there. She's the director of faculty and administration, faculty operations at the Air Force Academy, and it's just so wonderful for us here at the Cathedral to have what I believe is one of the most important ethical theologians in the Episcopal Church to talk about such an important topic, and that is the blurring of the categories of war and peace in our world due to technology, sinfulness and brokenness, and shifting geopolitical landscapes right before our eyes. So she's here to talk about all of that from a Christian perspective, and then at the end of the day, at the end of class, take questions. Please welcome Deonna warmly back to the Cathedral.
Thank you, Richard. I'm always very grateful when Dean Richard extends an invitation for me to come back, either to talk or to preach, and it's always just a privilege to be with you. And it's especially nice to be with a congregation who wants to think deeply and wants to think theologically about deep moral questions. That's not something we get to do very much in other places in the world. I think that's a unique vocation of the church. And for Christians in particular. So it's wonderful to be back here. So the title of my talk is Faithful Realism. A lot of you have probably heard realism in politics and so forth, but I want to talk about sort of faithful realism and sort of a way to think theologically about how Christians can be oriented to the world when we're in such an age of a global conflict. And you probably feel a little morally disoriented these days in watching the news and just seeing all the conflicts. We have a return to large-scale war in Europe, right, which we haven't seen in a very long time. We've got the devastating conflict in Gaza. We've got rising tensions in the Pacific. And then we always have the persistent violence that seems never ending in the Middle East and in Africa. So what I want us to think about is war is not just a political idea, it's a deeply moral and theological one. And so the question for us to think about is, what does it mean to be a follower of Christ in a world that seems permanently at war? And so we've talked about the just war tradition when I was here before. So what I want to talk about this morning is sort of a different question. And so how might Christian faith form our moral imagination in the face of today's global conflicts? So what kind of vision of truth, compassion, and responsibility can the church offer to a violent and polarized world? So here's what I want to talk about, just a little overview, talk about some Christian moral assumptions and foundations that we operate on, and to think about a couple lenses for moral discernment. truthfulness, compassion, and responsibility, and how these moral lenses might help us look at the global conflicts on the news in a different way. Because often we just get caught up in policy. Who's right? What should we do? What's the right diplomatic solution? But I think from a Christian perspective, we can look at what's going on with different lenses. What does it mean to speak truthfully? What does it mean to engage with compassion? And what does Christian responsibility look like? And then I'll take 3 cases. We'll look at Ukraine and Russia. We'll look at Gaza, and the Middle East, Hamas and Israel. And then we'll look briefly at Africa. And then we'll have hopefully some time for Q&A. Hopefully I go fast. All right, so what I've pulled up here is, it's called the Council on Foreign Relations Conflict Tracker. So if you ever want to go, what sort of conflicts are going on right now? I don't know if this is actually going to work on my screen. Okay, well, it works on my screen, but it doesn't work on your screen, so I'm just going to undo this. But if you go to cfr.org, you'll see these dots on your laptop, and you just hover over them, and then it will tell you who's in conflict and why and how long, and you can sort of click on them and kind of see some of the background. So that's just Africa, kind of the Middle East. We've got Russia, Ukraine. There's part of the world that's not even shown on here. So that's just to point out that conflict is going on, and conflict is continually going on. Okay, so Christian moral vision, 2 main pillars, if you want to. So the world is fallen. So what does that mean? Sin runs through every heart and every institution. But the world remains God's. It's created good. It's sustained by grace. And it's destined for redemption. Right? So we live in sort of this tension between the fact and reality of sin, but we also, as Christians, believe in the goodness and truthfulness of God, that it's created good, God sustains us, and we're destined for redemption in spite of sin. So we have 2 temptations, I think, as Christians. We can be naive idealists and just think, well, if we just try hard enough, then we'll have peace. It's just a matter of human will. We just have to get the right policies. We just have to work hard enough. We just have to get the right leaders in place, and then it'll all be fine. Well, the problem with that is that's just relying completely on human will, human efforts, right? And we know that we cannot bring about the kingdom of God purely by human efforts, right? So that's a naive idealism which we need to resist. But on the flip side, if we don't want to get demoralized by knowing that, well, yeah, we can, if we just work hard, bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth, but we don't want to be cynical either, right? So that's the other temptation. We don't want to say, well, war is inevitable and moral principles are just luxuries. So we don't want to go, might makes right. If we have the luxury of being moral, great, but in the face of bad circumstances, well, we can just jettison that and we can just do what we want, and so then it's just power all the way down. Well, that doesn't work for Christians either. So what we need is, what I'm proposing is sort of a middle position, sort of a faithful realism. So we're going to take sin seriously. That's kind of the realism part. But the faithfulness part is that we believe in the goodness of God sustained by grace and that we're destined for redemption. So we want to look at 3 lenses. I'm going to call it the shape of moral discernment. So I want to look at truthfulness, compassion, and responsibility. And how do we exercise these virtues as Christians in a violent age? All right. So first of all, war depends on distortion, right? We're all subject to propaganda. We have selective memory. We remember what we want to remember. We forget the things we want to forget. And we oversimplify good and we oversimplify evil. As we all know, most conflicts are extremely morally complex. There's moral complexity on both sides. There's usually a long history of grievances and injustices often that lead up to wars. So we can't just easily just say, well, these guys are good and these guys are evil, and so it's very clean. So we have to remember that truthfulness is important, And truthfulness is an antidote to the types of distortions that we're constantly subject to with respect to the kinds of messaging we're getting in conflict. So I think truth-telling is not only about personal honesty, but we need to think about truth-telling as a political vocation. I'll say that again. Like, truth-telling is a political vocation of the church. And to see truthfully means to resist both national self-righteousness and also moral equivalence. This is just not only for the United States, but any country. Okay? So, for example, what does truthfulness look like in Ukraine? All right? So we have to name Russia's invasion of Ukraine for what it is. It's a violation of sovereignty and justice, but we also have to recognize the complexity and cost of armed resistance. So in Gaza, what's truthfulness? We have to hold two truths simultaneously. We have to hold the moral horror of terrorism and of Hamas, but also the tragedy and disproportionate suffering that the folks in Gaza are experiencing. And so in our own nation, it means we have to confront narratives of exceptionalism that can blind us to our own complicity in global systems of violence. Okay. So to tell the truth in wartime itself is an act of moral courage. So just because we're not in the military, we're not out there fighting wars, or we might not even be part of any systems or in the government or industries that are directly sustaining the military, we still all have the ability to tell the truth. And that's an act of moral courage. Regardless of where we sit on the political spectrum, it doesn't matter what our vocation is, but as Christians, that's what God requires of us. So here is a World War I propaganda poster. So remember what I talked about, distortion? Destroy this mad brute, right? The Prussians. So what is this poster trying to tell us, right? That our enemy's a monster, right? See how oversized it is? We have an innocent woman being taken against her will, right? We got a big club of culture. So this is propaganda, this is distortion, this is a representation of the enemy that's false, right? But it's out there to manipulate us. It's to emotionally view our enemies in a certain way. Does that look like somebody made in the image and likeness of God? No, because when we think our enemies are monsters, and that means there's no moral rules that apply to them, right? And so that's what propaganda and distortion is trying to do, right? And so we think, well, that's a monster, the rules don't apply to them, I don't need to abide by the Geneva and the Hague Conventions, right? They're just evil personified, and so we can do what we want. So on your left, that's a German soldier. He looks like he's what, 17? And on the right, that's an American soldier tending to his wounds. So if you think about what that propaganda poster is trying to get us to think about who the enemy is, but that's actually the real face of the enemy. And look at the American soldier who sees the German soldier as a fellow human being who's wounded, who is in need of help. That's the truthful picture of war. All right, so let's talk about compassion. So compassion, keeping the human face visible. So every war dehumanizes, and the kinds of language we use around war facilitates this. We talk about collateral damage, we talk about civilian infrastructure, we talk about neutralizing targets, and all of this is designed to hide the human cost of war. Right? But Christian ethics insists that every person bears the image of God. And so compassion is part of the Christian vocation, is to remind us, continue to remind us, no matter how much we disagree or agree with whatever is going on in any particular conflict, that the individuals who are involved in them are still made in the image and likeness of God. Right? So compassion restores a moral vision to the conflict. right? And it refuses abstraction. So compassion restores moral vision by refusing abstraction. It's not sentimentality. It's the ability to suffer with someone, to see the other person as a human, even in enmity. That's what that is. That's compassion. Yep. Bonhoeffer wrote, "We must learn to regard people less in light of what they do or omit to do, but more in light of what they suffer." And so the church's task in wartime is not neutrality, but it's humanization. It's to remember that victims and perpetrators alike are subject to God's care, and that grief is a moral response and not a weakness. And I think that's really important. That we can grieve. I know when I was putting this together and I was searching through some photos, because I wanted to be very careful with the kinds of photos I selected for this particular presentation. And I saw some pretty horrific ones, and I found myself just weeping. Like, I just burst into tears just putting this presentation together, right? Because it was really immersing myself in the pain and the suffering and the complexity and the futility sometimes of the wars, and wondering, what is it that we're doing? So grief is a moral response and not a weakness. A good friend of mine who's a therapist said, if you find yourself crying, it means that you're alive. We're not numbed out. We're not trying to avoid it, but to allow ourselves to grieve is in some ways allowing ourselves to really live. This is one of my favorite photos. It's a World War II photo, and this is a soldier comforting one of his fellow soldiers. Right? In a moment, it looks like R&R, because the person on the top left is writing a letter home, is broken down into grief, and he's being comforted by a fellow soldier. Okay, responsibility. So responsibility, it's about owning the fact that we are responsible and we can be faithful, but within limits. And so power always tempts us to self-deception. So in the name of security or defense, we justify almost anything. So if you think back to political campaigns, whether Democrat, Republican, or Tory, or whoever, wherever part in the world, what is the main thing, right? People are trying to make you feel afraid and to vote for them, and they'll help you feel more secure, right? So this appeals to our sense of we want to feel safe, and so oftentimes the levels of threat that people say we're under might be, again, distorted, because we know we're going to vote for someone that we believe is going to keep us safe. So Reinhold Niebuhr warned that collective pride is the great sin of nations, and the belief that our intentions purify our actions. So faithful realism calls us to hold power accountable, to question our own moral blind spots, and to seek policies that protect dignity rather than dominance. And responsibility extends to citizens, to how our economies, technologies, and consumption choices contribute to systems of violence. And so ethics begins not only in policy, but in conscience. So this is a picture of just a random town hall by a representative in California, I believe. So the representative's at the podium, and you have all the people, and my question to you is, where is the power in the room? All right, so now I want to kind of take those things, truthfulness, compassion, responsibility, and let's look at Ukraine and Russia, Israel, Hamas, and then briefly at Africa. All right, so Ukraine. We call this the ethics of resistance and solidarity. So Ukraine presents the classic case of a nation resisting unjust aggression. It clearly satisfies the just war tradition, legitimate authority, just cause, last resort, right? Russia's invasion of Ukraine clearly violates the UN Charter. So this is very clean with respect to the just war tradition. But as Christians, we need to ask deeper questions too. So how long does resistance remain morally sustainable when destruction mounts? So no matter how wrong Russia was to invade Ukraine, does Ukraine have a moral responsibility to sort of evaluate what level of cost and destruction to its own citizens and to its own infrastructure that they're willing to sustain before they might surrender, right? So do you sacrifice the entire population of your country in order to prove a point? So how long do you resist, and how do you think about that? And I don't know what the right answer is, but that's an important question to ask, right? So some of you probably remember back in the Cold War days, right? There was a phrase, better dead than red, right? But that's an interesting question. Like, how many millions of people in the United States would we be willing to sacrifice in war to preserve democracy? Or would we surrender and live under a communist government for some particular period of time before we might mount an internal resistance and fight again, right? So it wouldn't make sense to sacrifice the population of your entire country, because then there would be nobody left to govern, right? So these are important moral questions. And how do we avoid letting hatred of evil become hatred of the enemy? That's very hard to do. So the church's role is to sustain moral memory. It's to insist that war, however justified, is always lamentable. Augustine has a beautiful line in The City of God where he talks about the soldier participating in war in tears, right? Knowing that in some ways it's the right thing to do, but it's lamentable, it's grief, it's tragic, right? And to hold these two truths in tension. So we have to insist that war, however justified, is always lamentable, and to call the world to post-war reconciliation as well as victory. So this is a photo of some Orthodox in Ukraine at a funeral for a 4-year-old who was killed in the attacks. So these are the Ukrainians. That's a Russian prisoner of war. Right, so we see the cost on both sides. We have the tragic death of a 4-year-old, which is just one data point, right? And we have hundreds of thousands of Russians who have been killed and also maimed and injured quite severely. These are the things as Christians we have to remember. Okay, Israel and Gaza. So I think the theme of lament is probably the most apt word when we think of what's going on. So lament refuses the easy binaries of pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. It names the atrocities of Hamas's terror, but also it names the suffering of Gazan civilians as twin moral wounds. Lament is theologically necessary because it prevents despair, but it also prevents vengeance. It reminds us that justice and mercy are not opposites, but they're dimensions of divine love. And our ethical task is not to prescribe solutions, but to keep alive a moral vocabulary that refuses to dehumanize either side. I don't know what other institutions or avenues within our society where this is possible or where this is taking place. What institutions, other than the church, are keeping alive a moral vocabulary, right, that insists on not dehumanizing the enemy, that can talk about lament, that can understand mercy and justice as things that need to go together and that are not polar opposites? I think this is really the true vocation of the church. So when we think about the atrocity of Hamas. So that was after a Hamas terrorist attack in Israel in October. And this is what we have in Gaza. So it's really difficult to pick sides. And all we can do is lament at the state of the world in which this level of terrorism and war and human suffering is going on. All right, the global south. Now we don't tend to think about what's going on in Africa as much. So in this particular case, because if you remember the CFR thing I put up right at the beginning, a lot of those dots are in Africa. And so maybe we think about the global south as the ethics of attention. So hundreds of thousands of people die in forgotten wars. The Sudan, Congo, Haiti. And so the moral crisis, Simone Weil would say, is it's a crisis of attention, or it's a crisis of forgetfulness. So Simone Weil wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." So think about when you're struggling and you feel like no one's paying attention to you, right? What does that do? It increases loneliness, a sense of isolation, that you're by yourself, that you have no resources, that you have no support. But when someone really attends to us, they give us their full attention, we feel seen, we feel like we're recognized as a human person, someone's willing to walk with us in our suffering, even if they can't fix it, right? But they're there with us in solidarity. And so for our wars in the global south, our call is to attend, even if we can't fix it, right? But keeping it as part of our attention matters. So to attend is to affirm that every life matters equally before God, regardless of media visibility or strategic importance. So Christians must resist the moral provincialism that values lives by proximity or familiarity. And this is one of the great gifts of the Catholicity, if you will, of the church. We say we believe in one holy Catholic, lowercase c, and apostolic church. It's the Catholicity of the church. There are Christians who live in almost every corner of the globe, right? So we are connected as members of the body of Christ with our Christian brothers and sisters who live in Africa, who live in Ukraine, right? And so we are connected to them through being part of the body of Christ. And so attending to them is attending to ourselves as well. So attention itself is an act of solidarity and prayer. So here's a picture of, the rebels called the M23s because they sort of had this revolution March of 23. So these are the actual government soldiers and government officials of the elected government in Congo that was overthrown by the rebels. So she's probably 2, right? Pushing a suitcase to a border checkpoint to escape the Congo. So at its core, conflict is not only political, but it's spiritual. It's a manifestation of what Scripture calls sin. But Christian ethics never ends with sin. It always moves toward grace. And grace is God's persistent refusal to abandon creation to violence, right? And that's why the church cannot baptize the logic of domination. So in every conflict, the question is not simply who is right, but how does God's love call us to act here? it's really easy for us to want to take sides. And in certain conflicts, obviously there are some sides that are more justified than others. But by taking a side and then not recognizing the humanity and the actual human beings on the other side that we might disagree with, can lead us into all sorts of problems spiritually. We can forget that people are made in the image and likeness of God. It doesn't attend to our own seeing things as morally complex. And it can keep us not wanting to be compassionate. You know, the picture of the Russian prisoner of war, he was an older guy, right? He's not 17 with no hands, right? How can we not have compassion on the face of that person? So as Christian witness, we're called to be peacemakers, not bystanders. But there's different ways in which we can do this. You know, being a peacemaker doesn't mean that you have to go to every political rally and have big signs. You know, some people feel called to that, and that's how they feel engaged. Not all of us are wired that way, right? So there's other ways for us to think about how can we act faithfully in our domains when it comes to being oriented as Christians to the global conflict. So first, for all citizens, we have to cultivate informed moral judgment. So look at multiple news sources. Try to talk to people who are affected by the conflict. I was doing a project for a class, and I picked the Russia-Ukraine war. And so I got connected with a Ukrainian family who fled Ukraine, and they're living here in Denver. Mom's here. She has 2 sons. And just to talk about their journey from leaving Ukraine and to get to the United States and what that was like, what it was like for her children to experience that, what it's like living here and like FaceTiming her husband who's still fighting in Ukraine. And whenever he gets leave, they meet in Germany for a couple weeks. And she comes back here with her children, and he goes back to fighting. So that personal connection of just talking to people who have lived that was very helpful, right? To get the personal sense of how the war is affecting this particular family versus getting caught up in sort of the bigger national security questions about the Russia-Ukraine war. So professionals, whether we're in medicine, law, technology, or the military, we can think about how do we integrate moral responsibility into our vocation. So for those of us who might be in the tech field, you know, what are the technologies that we're working on, especially for engineers, and we're designing, what are they going to be used for? What sort of ethical protocols might we ask to be put in place before a particular technology is used? Should we be careful about who buys our technologies? Or do we just send it to the highest bidder if we're just worried about the bottom line? So how might the work that you do, whether in your medicine, law, the military, contribute to peace, justice, or the protection of life? So for me, working at the Air Force Academy, I'm right in the middle of obviously working for the Department of Defense, also known as Department of War now. Even that name changes the culture of the institution. Because think about that. The Department of Defense versus the Department of War. Just that one change in word changes the whole ethos and culture of what it means to be a professor and forming young men and women into the profession of arms. So part of what I do is I teach professional ethics, and I teach the ethics of war. So at least I want them to know there are rules. We talk about what happens if you're given an illegal or immoral order. What do you do? What does it mean to form a sound conscience in a military member, and why is that important? And if we don't do that, then what are some of the consequences? So I have absolutely no say in the national security policy, right, of the United States, but I do have a small say in my classroom of 18 cadets who I see, right, to remind them about the importance of professionalism, conscience, the ethics of war, humanizing the enemy, understanding that what they might do is they're going to face tragedy, that there's consequences to them physically and morally and emotionally, and to be honest with them, right? So that's a form of truth-telling that I can do in the classroom, while still being in line with the curriculum, right, that the Air Force Academy executes to help form our young men and women. So for the church, it's important that we resist moralism, and it's important that we're just not silent. So I know sometimes when we say the prayers of the people, sometimes we kind of can check out because it's the same prayers over and over and over again. But by praying them over and over and over and over and over again is actually itself an act of witness, right? It's an act of attending, and it's an act of not being silent, and it's an act of remembering that there is conflict, there is war, there are people suffering outside of our own space. There's people who are suffering with whom we're not familiar, right? And we can often feel helpless in the face of all of that. But yet, by praying to God and asking for God's grace and mercy, that's actually a meaningful act of Christian vocation and witness. Because if we're not doing it here, and in churches around the globe, Christian churches, then who is, right? Who is keeping that moral vocabulary alive? Who is attending? Who is naming moral complexity? Who is lamenting? Who is crying out to God for justice and mercy? That's the role and vocation of the church. So peacemaking, in Jesus' words, is not passive, but it seeks justice without cruelty and reconciliation without illusion. I think that's important. It seeks justice without cruelty and reconciliation without illusion. That's how we can be faithful, but also being realistic at the same time. So we cannot abolish war by moral argument alone, but we can resist moral corrosion. We can resist war just going to the point where there are no rules. It's just barbarism. And it's okay to allow ourselves to be touched by the tragedies of war. And yes, we don't want to maybe just be immersed in it all the time, because, we can't sustain that, a lot of us spiritually. There's other things and other areas of responsibility we're called to. But it is important that we still attend to whatever ability we each have to what's going on, and allow ourselves to feel the pain. And again, just because we feel the pain, it doesn't mean that we're weak, and it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us, and that if we were stronger or more faithful Christians, we would just let this roll off our back. But if we were desensitized to it and it didn't affect us, I think that would be more spiritually concerning, right? Because Jesus was affected by the suffering that he saw, right? I thank God for the 2 words or 3 words, and Jesus wept. Thank God for those words in Scripture. Because otherwise we might have a Scripture that presents Jesus as some superhero or some superhuman, right? But he was compassionate, he wept with folks, he was moved by suffering, and that's also what we're called to do, and we're called to do that without losing hope. So we can keep truth alive in the age of propaganda, and it's really helpful for us to question ourselves sometimes when we feel either super righteous about something or absolutely morally convicted that we are right, this is usually a good warning flag sometimes to just double check and go, okay, what are my assumptions here? What am I not seeing? What's the other side to the story? Just some self-evaluation so we stay humble and knowing that we could be wrong sometimes in our evaluations of things. So we can keep truth alive in the age of propaganda. We can be compassionate. We can keep that alive in the face of indifference. And I think oftentimes we can be indifferent or we see others who are indifferent. And I think the indifference sometimes is a mask for just not being able to face up to the pain that encountering things that disturb us so deeply impacts us. So we might feign indifference, but really I do think the indifference can be a mask for we actually do feel this so deeply that we're afraid that if we confront that pain, that we're not going to know how to deal with it. So we try to numb out or we're desensitized. And so we can also keep responsibility alive in the culture of power. We still have town halls. You can still write letters to congressmen. You can still make phone calls. You can still write emails. We can still gather as members of community. And we can do that responsibly, right, within the limits of the law and within the limits of Christian faithfulness. That is something we are able to do. And so faithful realism doesn't offer certainty, but it offers character, right? And I think as Christians, that's what the bottom line is for us. It's like I said at the beginning, it's not about what policy is right or who's right, but how do we interact with this morally complex world in a faithful way as Christians, right? And that's a matter of character and the kinds of virtues that we cultivate individually and as a community. And to remind ourselves that truthfulness is important and that compassion has to be exercised, that moral responsibility is a requirement. And these are things the church keeps alive, and as a community, it's important that we remind ourselves that Christian character matters. And so it's not about, as Christians, what policy do we support? Because that's just a treacherous alignment. Because oftentimes when we're presented with facts or information about policies, we don't know all of the story, right? So we're being asked to take sides sometimes based on limited facts or propaganda or distortions, right, that we talked about at the beginning. So I think it's really, as Christians, we have to be careful about jumping on one side too fast or condemning another side too fast. But it's more important that we think about how do I exercise truthfulness, compassion, and responsibility given the information that I've been given and given the opportunities for me to participate or intervene or in my own domain act faithfully. So Christian character, right, is about forming people who can see the world as it is and to love it as God loves it and to act in it with courage and restraint, right? God and Christ see the world as it is, right? Christ sees the world in all its sinfulness, all its brokenness, all its tragedy. And as Christians, that's what we're also called to see. The world we're all created in the image and likeness of God. God sustains us with God's grace, and in the end, so it's having our moral purchase in those two things, or feeling too self-righteous.
Harold Winters. So I'm wondering, those individuals that you may make a similar presentation to, who do not identify as Christians or who are not based in a religious faith, do you find a response which you find is encouraging? And is there an embracing of these same things amongst people who do not necessarily think of themselves as Christian?
Thank you. Great question. So you're the first audience I've ever given this particular presentation to. In this form. So I guess I would say, teaching at the Air Force Academy, there are, cadets and faculty of different faiths or of no faith at all. But yet for most, there's still a profound sensitivity to the reality of what war is. And I think part of that's like being in a military environment and people who have been deployed, especially so many of our current serving military, were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And because we study war from different disciplines, I think deep down people recognize that it is morally complex. And, I have friends who are philosophers, who might not ascribe to any particular religious point of view, but who are also think truth matters, that compassion is still important, and that restraint is important too, just as a matter of like what is true about what it means to be human. And there's resources even in classical philosophy that also point to the importance of these things as well. But what I would say from the church in particular, so those would just be individuals trying on their own to navigate a complex moral space. But what I think is unique about the church is we hold these beliefs to be true as a community, right? And as a community, we have agency, right? Especially when you think about the church in its global form, right? In different forums where the voice of Christians can be made known on a greater and more collective scale. So that's why I think the church actually does have, can have a lot of power if it's united, right? Especially across denominations or even in interreligious dialogues that are advocating for these same sorts of principles of character in war. Thank you for that question.
This relates to a comment actually you made, I remember even from your previous presentation here, which is the detachment of even people in the Air Force from the consequences of what they're doing. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of the attack on Dresden in World War II that killed many people, but then isn't there a danger with technology and elsewhere for an increased detachment of lack of really understanding the humanitarian impact? I spend my life doing an update on Ukraine, and I'll mention two things that are often missed. First of all, the Russian soldiers tend to be from nationalities that are in eastern Ukraine, far detached from the leadership that is in fact directing this war. They're generally contract soldiers, but it's a tragic impact on the people being used by leaders. Very little discussion about the impact on the Donbass, which is the most populated region. A lot of discussion about children, but you're destroying one of the most populated areas. There's no, so when you talk about boundaries and things like that. So I just wanted to ask you, with technology and AI, isn't there a danger of increased detachment from the humanitarian impact?
Yes, I think that's absolutely a danger. And I think that's why, like, embedded journalists in areas of conflict are actually really important, that we get photos, like not AI manipulated photos. That was funny, when I was looking through the AP website, it had like war photos 2024, and they had like a header, like none of these have been, manipulated by AI, right? They actually had that header. And so when you go through and you actually look at those photos, right, and you look at the people, you look at this destruction from on the ground, right, that's where you're able to see the impacts of sort of what, as a military person, like you might be doing. Apple had that series, Masters of the Air, I think. It's great. I highly encourage you to watch it. But there's one episode where one of the B-17 pilots is just very crass about dropping the bombs. And there was another person on his crew who's like, no, you don't understand like what we're doing here. And they had gotten this big argument. And then like 2 episodes later, that B-17 pilot like got shot down, was a prisoner of war, and like got marched through one of the cities that he destroyed. And so he got to see firsthand the destruction of the bombs on the city. And then the people who saw that he was like an American pilot, like attacked him and just started beating him and shouting at him about how angry what they were about like the destructiveness of the technology. So I thought that was a very good scene in that series about how the soldier at first didn't understand what he was doing. He was detached, right? He just saw it as like, oh, it's a bomb, it's way down there, they're the enemy, whatever. But then when he gets captured and then he actually encounters the people who he destroyed and saw what he did, right, that actually had a very big impact on him, right? And then the consequences for his actions were driven home, right? So this is why I think professional military education is absolutely critical, right? This is why it's really important that we can teach our senior military leaders strategy, national security policy, all the things, and that's important, right? But we also have to continue to keep the human element of war fighting still present and train our military members to be able to hold those things in tension, right? To be able to go and execute the mission if it's authorized, right, and to use lethal force, but also at the same time, like, do it with a sense of sobriety, right? And that they understand the tragedy of it, that it's necessary, but there's also a cost, and learning how to live with that, right? Because we get in trouble if we don't keep the human element present, and then our soldiers go into areas of conflict, and they're not really prepared or they haven't thought through it, and that's when we get PTSD, moral injury, and all those sorts of things. Yes. Who's next?
Yeah, Clark, thank you very much. It was fascinating. I really appreciate it. The one thing, and you just mentioned it, that I think is important, aside from church, which is a group of people, is the individual and the moral injury, which the VA is now starting to address. Thank you.
Yes, I'm glad we're starting to deal with moral injury. That's been helpful. Yeah. Yes,
I'd
sir.
be interested in your comments on the legal and ethical ramifications of the campaign against the drug smuggling boats that's going on right now.
Yeah, so I'm probably not going to comment on policy directly. But I think as citizens, it's important that we review like what our constitutional mechanisms are for the authorization of the use of force. I think I remember Congress going, hey, we should have been consulted. It doesn't mean we were going to tell you no, but at least we should have been consulted, right? So again, that's something as citizens, not necessarily taking sides, right or wrong, right, but reminding our elected officials, look, we understand the world is complex, right? There's technology, there's all the stuff, but we do have mechanisms, right, and policies and rules and modes of governance to try to be able to address these things. And if it turns out that our current modes of governance and policies and rules aren't suitable to unique cases and new things that we're experiencing because of technology, then we need to put our minds to, okay, then what do we need to do? What do we need to change? What should we do differently? But that still holds government accountable, that we make sure we're still abiding by international laws and so forth. And by the way, nothing I should have said at the beginning, my views do not reflect the Department of Defense. And they're purely my own.
Hi. Yesterday, I saw the film at the Sea Center, which I think today is the last day for it. It's the Orwell documentary, 2 + 2 = 5, which has to do with all the propaganda stuff and how, and it's chilling, but
It is.
very important. You should watch it. It marries perfectly with your presentation. What happens when you have wanting morally centered people, that's kind of obnoxious to say, across all religions, wanting to unite to fight bad things happening in the world? What happens when you have Christian nationalists take over the propaganda machines across an entire nation like we're seeing now?
Yeah, so I think Christian nationalism is, something that's real, and that I think as Christians who don't support that view need to do some truth-telling and speak into that space, right? I mean, we've got Galatians, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female, right? So to be a Christian is to transcend any sort of national, economic, or social identity, right? It's really difficult to have a Catholic, I believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church, right, if we're advocating for an alignment between a particular form of government and the Christian religion. It's just fraught with a lot of problems. So, yeah, it's a difficult space. But again, that's truth-telling, right? It's trying to understand why particular groups want to advocate for Christian nationalism. Why is that so important? Why is that so appealing to folks, right? And sometimes, because I think we're formed so much earlier for most citizens in our national political identity, right? Pledge of Allegiance, the flag, all the things we learn U.S. history. So our political identity, right, is deeply instilled in us from a very early age, where many people don't get very solid Christian or theological formation at all, right? And sometimes the theological formation that we have isn't adequate enough to really have the nuance and the sophistication to sort of see why a Christian nationalist viewpoint is deeply problematic with respect to the gospel. And so that's, again, the church, right? We can work on that. We have things to say. We can speak truthfully into that space. We can resist that, right? While at the same time, like being, having good sort of moral character, right? So being compassionate, not being contemptible, and just trying to speak truth into that space, right? Because now when Christians are fighting Christians, then, we really have a problem, right? So, all right, so I think it's 10:15. Okay.
What you're saying sounds very empathetic. And my question's related to what Ginger had asked, and that is, and part of this is because I'm bumping up against this in the civilian sphere, and so I listened to your presentation today, and yes, what you're saying is true for the military, but it's also the same struggle, the same warfare we're having as civilians. And I'm wondering to what extent you officially, from the top down, as well as from the cadets, the people that are coming in as recruits or enlisted people, in some cases in a different situation, conscripts, to what extent is what you're saying being undercut or changed to a policy that does other people, that does make it easier to separate from others and to basically to make an entirely different approach, and rather than being defense, it is offensive war?
So I'm not quite sure I understand what the question is.
It's a kind of a realistic question. what are you actually feeling from the people that, from the cadets, for example, that may come from a more Christian nationalistic perspective, or a perspective where they don't really see everyone as having the image of God. So there's people that are, and then there's the official positions that, I mean, we do have someone running the five-sided building who is influenced by a faith tradition that does not, that does other, and that does not see all people as having the image of God. So how is there a policy change that's beginning to happen?
No. No, I mean, I think just as, you know, you are always going to get people coming through the military and policies that change, right, throughout our institutions that have different sort of points of view about how people are viewed, but I'm not finding anything particularly alarming from my cadets or my fellow colleagues at the academy, particularly. You know, I've got 18-year-olds from all parts of America in my classroom, so they represent all the different views of America as well, and I don't necessarily see that changed. So I guess my answer is no. Me in just my small little space, I'm not finding that to be an oversized problem.
Before we thank Deonna, and we will thank Deonna, let's take just a moment of silence. You know, this has been a lot to see and a lot to think through, and Deonna's done a sophisticated and excellent job of helping us to be attentive. So let's take a moment of silence. I bet you'll all join me in thanking Deonna just for her time, for her specificity, and even courage in being here. It just means so much that you are doing this. We're profoundly grateful. So let's give her a round of applause. For everyone joining us via the live stream, do come back. Holy Eucharist begins at 10:30 a.m. at the same place, sjcathedral.org. Take care, everyone.